There are secrets nations bury so deep they become mythology. Whispers that echo through the centuries, dismissed as slander, as impossible rumor, as the desperate lies of political enemies. But what occurs when the impossible becomes undeniable? When DNA cannot lie, when historical records align like pieces of a puzzle no one wished to solve. When descendants of both the powerful and the powerless tell the same story across 200 years. In Virginia's rolling hills, there stands a mansion named Monticello. Beautiful, iconic, a monument to American genius and enlightenment. Yet beneath its elegant columns, within its carefully preserved rooms, behind the gardens Thomas Jefferson himself designed, there lived a secret so disturbing, so contradictory to all its owner professed to believe, it would take nearly 200 years for America to face the truth. A secret involving 38 years of silence, 6 children born into bondage who looked remarkably like the president, and a woman who possessed no power to refuse. This is not a tale of monsters or demons. It is something far more unsettling, far more real, far more human in its cruelty. This is the story of a man who wrote that all men are created equal while owning over 600 human beings across his lifetime. A man who publicly mourned his wife's death while privately continuing a relationship with her half-sister. A woman who had no legal rights, no voice, no choice. A man whose words shaped a nation and inspired global revolutions, while his actions revealed the darkest contradictions of his era and of ours. Before we continue with the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, I need you to do something. If you're fascinated by the dark, hidden corners of American history, by the secrets that shape this nation, by the contradictions that still haunt us today, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you listening from? Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far these stories reach. How many of us are prepared to face the uncomfortable truths of our past? Now, let me take you back to a time when America was young. When the ideals of liberty and the reality of slavery existed side by side, when one man could write of freedom while denying it to those closest to him. The year was 1772, and Thomas Jefferson was 29 when he married Martha Wales Skelton on New Year's Day. She was 23, a wealthy widow whose first marriage lasted only 3 years before her husband died. Considered one of Virginia's most eligible women, not just for her inheritance, but for her beauty, her education, her refinement. She played the harpsichord with skill that impressed even Virginia's most cultured society. She spoke French. She had read extensively. By all accounts, she was precisely the kind of woman a man like Thomas Jefferson would choose, and by all contemporary accounts, it was a love match. This was rare for an era when marriages among the Virginia gentry were often carefully calculated arrangements of property and alliance, where love was a pleasant bonus but hardly necessary. Jefferson's friends noted how he doted on her, how they would make music together for hours, he on his violin, she on her harpsichord. They read to each other. They discussed philosophy and literature. They seemed genuinely happy. But Martha brought more than love and refinement to Monticello. When her father, John Wales, died in 1773, just over a year after her marriage to Jefferson, she inherited a substantial fortune, 11,000 acres of land, 135 enslaved people, and debts. Enormous debts that would plague Jefferson for the rest of his life, debts he would never fully escape. Among those 135 enslaved people was a family called the Hemings. They were what Virginia termed bright mulattoes, people of mixed African and European ancestry whose skin was light enough they could sometimes pass for white. The family matriarch was Elizabeth Hemings, a woman born into slavery around 1735. Her mother, according to family oral history, was a full-blooded African woman captured and brought to Virginia in chains. Her father was an English sea captain named Hemings. Elizabeth Hemings had 12 children. 6 of them, including a girl named Sally, were fathered by John Wales himself, Martha Jefferson's father. Which meant that Sally Hemings, who came to Monticello as part of Martha's inheritance, was Martha's half-sister. They shared a father. They had grown up in the same household, though in vastly different circumstances, Martha in the main house, learning the harpsichord and French, Sally in the slave quarters, learning to serve and obey. Sally was 11 years old when she arrived at Monticello in 1773. Virginia in the 1770s was a place of stark, brutal contradictions. In plantation drawing rooms like Monticello's, wealthy men in powdered wigs debated natural rights and the tyranny of kings. They read John Locke and discussed the social contract. They spoke of liberty and the inherent dignity of men. And then they walked out of those rooms and gave orders to human beings they owned, people who could be bought, sold, and bred like livestock, people with no legal rights whatsoever. The law was clear and absolute, partis sequitur ventrum, the child follows the condition of the mother. It didn't matter if your father was a plantation owner, a gentleman, a member of the House of Burgesses, even a future president. If your mother was enslaved, so were you. This law had been on Virginia's books since 1662, designed specifically to ensure that the children of enslaved women remained enslaved, even when fathered by white men, even when those children were the master's own sons and daughters. This legal principle meant John Wales could father 6 children with Elizabeth Hemings and never acknowledge them as his own, never give them his name, never free them. They were his property. His daughters, yes, but also his property. And when he died, they became his legitimate daughter Martha's property, which meant they became Thomas Jefferson's property. Consider what this meant for Martha Jefferson. She inherited her own half-siblings as slaves. She gave orders to her father's children by another woman. And she knew. She had to know. Everyone in Virginia society knew how these things worked. It was an open secret, understood but never discussed in polite company. Thomas and Martha Jefferson's marriage was, by all accounts, deeply happy despite the financial pressures and moral contradictions surrounding them. They had 6 children together over 10 years, a daughter named Martha, called Patsy, born in 1772, a son named Jane who died at 1, a son who lived only weeks, never named, a daughter named Mary, called Polly, born in 1778, another daughter named Lucy Elizabeth who died at 4 months, and another daughter, also named Lucy Elizabeth, born in 1782. But each pregnancy took a toll on Martha's health. She had never been robust. The repeated pregnancies, births, nursing, and grief of losing children weakened her progressively. By 1782, after her 6th child's birth, it was clear she was dying. The months of Martha's final illness were agonizing. Thomas Jefferson rarely left her bedside. Their daughter Patsy, then 10, later wrote that her father nursed her mother with such unremitting devotion that even the servants were moved. He would sit with her for hours, holding her hand, reading to her, trying to comfort her as she grew weaker. In Monticello's slave quarters, Sally Hemings was 20. She worked in the main house, not the fields. The Hemings family held privileged positions among the enslaved. Sally's older brothers, James and Robert, were trained as artisans, James as a chef, Robert as a joiner and carpenter. Her mother, Elizabeth, essentially managed the household, supervising the enslaved women who cooked, cleaned, and cared for the Jefferson children. But privilege is relative when you can be sold at any moment, when you have no legal rights, when your body is not your own, when your children will be born into the same bondage. The Hemings family may have had better food, clothing, and less demanding work than field slaves, but they were still slaves. They could still be whipped, sold, had no legal recourse, no protection, no freedom. On September 6, 1782, Martha Jefferson died at 33, just 4 months after giving birth. The birth had devastated her already fragile health. For weeks she lingered between life and death while Thomas sat beside her, watching helplessly as the woman he loved slipped away. According to daughter Patsy, present during her mother's final hours, Martha made Thomas promise something before she died. The exact words were never recorded, but the family understood. Thomas Jefferson was never to remarry. He was never to bring another woman into Monticello as his wife, never give his children a stepmother, never replace her. Why extract this promise? Was it simply a dying woman's fear her children would be mistreated by a stepmother? Or did she know, suspect, fear something about what might happen after she was gone? Did she look at Sally Hemings, her own half-sister, and understand the vulnerability of an enslaved woman in a household without a white mistress to offer even minimal protection? We will never know. But Thomas Jefferson gave his word, and he kept it. He never remarried. For the remaining 44 years of his life, he remained a widower. Jefferson was shattered by Martha's death. For weeks, he locked himself in his room. Patsy later wrote he walked incessantly back and forth, so lost in grief he seemed almost mad. When he finally emerged, he would ride for hours through Monticello's woods in those melancholy rambles, as if he could outrun his grief. His friends worried. They had never seen him like this. Jefferson was known for self-control, rationality, mastering his emotions through reason. But Martha's death broke something in him. For months, he could barely function, neglecting correspondence, unable to work, write, or eat. Finally, in 1783, friends convinced him to accept an appointment as a trade commissioner to France. It would get him away from Monticello, away from the memories, away from the grief. It would give him purpose, a reason to live. In 1784, he sailed for Paris, taking his eldest daughter Patsy. His youngest surviving daughter, Polly, was left in Virginia with her aunt. She was only 6, considered too young for the dangerous voyage. Paris in the 1780s was a city of enlightenment and revolution, of salons and philosophers, of art and ideas reshaping the world. A city where the old order was cracking, where people questioned monarchy, aristocracy, divine right. A city that would soon explode into revolution. Thomas Jefferson thrived there. He moved in the highest circles of French society, attended salons where Europe's brightest minds debated philosophy and politics. He was admired as an architect of American independence, the Declaration's author, a living symbol of the new republic. He collected art, wine, books, studied architecture and agriculture, fell in love with French culture, food, ideas. He also, according to some historians, fell in love with a woman named Maria Causeway, a beautiful, talented artist married to a much older man. Their relationship, conducted through surviving letters, was intense and emotional, though whether it was physically consummated remains debated. What is clear is that Jefferson was capable of deep romantic feeling, not the cold, purely rational figure some biographies portray. For 3 years, Jefferson lived in Paris as American minister. He negotiated trade agreements, sent reports on European politics, advised the French on their revolutionary stirrings. And he tried to forget the grief that had nearly destroyed him. But in 1787, he decided to send for his youngest daughter. Polly was now 9, old enough for the voyage. He missed her, wanted his family together. He arranged her passage from Virginia to France. And because she was only 9, because she needed someone to accompany her, care for her, keep her safe, someone was chosen for this task, Sally Hemings. She was 14. Think what this meant. A 14-year-old enslaved girl sent across the Atlantic with a 9-year-old in her care, to a foreign country where she didn't speak the language, knew no one except the men who owned her. The voyage took weeks. The ship's captain, Andrew Ramsay, later noted Sally took excellent care of Polly during the crossing, gentle, patient, responsible beyond her years. She comforted the child during storms, kept her clean and fed, essentially served as her mother. When they arrived in Paris in July 1787, something extraordinary happened. Sally Hemings discovered that under French law, she was free. Slavery was not legal in France. The principle was clear: any enslaved person who set foot on French soil could claim freedom. They could refuse to return, walk away, build a new life. Sally Hemings could have been free. She could have stayed in Paris, refused to return to Virginia, claimed her freedom under French law, and there would have been nothing Thomas Jefferson could legally do. But she was 14. Alone in a foreign city. She didn't speak French. She had no money, no family, no resources, no way to support herself. And Thomas Jefferson was 44, powerful, persuasive, sophisticated, the men married to her half-sister, the men who legally owned her and her entire family in Virginia. What happened next is where the historical record becomes murky, where we must read between the lines of letters, account books, later testimonies, imagine what cannot be documented because enslaved people's lives were not considered worth documenting in detail. What we know for certain, Sally Hemings remained in Paris for over 2 years. She lived in the same house as Thomas Jefferson and his daughters. She learned French. She was paid wages, something that would never happen in Virginia, where enslaved people received no compensation. Account books show regular payments to Sally for her services. She also, according to her son Madison Hemings's later testimony, became pregnant during this time in Paris. She was 16. Thomas Jefferson was 46. According to Madison Hemings, who gave an interview to an Ohio newspaper in 1873, his mother told him she was treated well in Paris, that Jefferson made her certain promises. He promised if she returned to Virginia with him, he would free all their children when they reached 21. He promised special treatment, that they would be taught trades, prepared for freedom. But why would Sally Hemings agree to return to slavery? Why give up her freedom in France to return to Virginia, where she would again be property, where her children would be born into bondage? Perhaps she loved him. Perhaps she believed his promises. Perhaps she felt she had no real choice, that a 14-year-old alone in Paris had no prospects, that with Jefferson she would have security, protection, a place. Perhaps she thought of her family in Virginia, her mother, brothers, sisters still enslaved at Monticello, and knew if she stayed in France, she would never see them again. Or perhaps she simply had no power to refuse. Perhaps Jefferson made it clear her family would suffer if she didn't return. Perhaps promises were accompanied by threats. Perhaps a 16-year-old enslaved girl, pregnant with the child of one of America's most powerful men, understood she had no real choice at all. We will never know Sally Hemings's true thoughts or feelings because she left no written record. Enslaved people were forbidden by Virginia law from learning to read and write. Even if she had been literate, kept a diary or letters, they would not have survived. The voices of the enslaved have been largely erased, their stories told only through others' accounts, their inner lives forever lost. What we know, in October 1789, Thomas Jefferson returned to Virginia. Sally Hemings returned with him, and she was pregnant. The child, a son, was born in 1790. He lived only a short time, but he was the first of 6 children Sally Hemings would bear over the next 18 years. 6 children, all conceived during periods when Thomas Jefferson was documented to be at Monticello. 6 children who bore a striking resemblance to the president. The whispers began almost immediately. Monticello was not isolated. There were constant visitors, neighbors, plantation owners, politicians, scientists, artists. There were overseers, hired workers, other enslaved people who saw, remembered, talked. There were Jefferson's own legitimate grandchildren who grew up playing with children who looked remarkably like their grandfather. The resemblance was noted by many. One visitor wrote Sally Hemings's children were white enough to pass for white, and bore a striking resemblance to the president. Another noted one of Sally's sons looked so much like Jefferson that, at some distance or in the dusk of evening he could be mistaken for the president. But in Virginia plantation society, there was an unspoken rule: you didn't talk about these things openly. Everyone knew white men fathered children with enslaved women. It was common, perhaps expected. But it was not discussed in polite company, not acknowledged. The children of these unions remained enslaved, invisible, unacknowledged by their white fathers. Thomas Jefferson's situation differed only in degree, not kind. He was more famous, powerful, publicly committed to ideals of liberty and equality. The contradiction was more glaring, more impossible to ignore, but the basic pattern was the same as on thousands of other Southern plantations. In 1802, whispers became public. A journalist named James Callender published explosive allegations in the Richmond Recorder. Callender, once a Jefferson ally, had fallen out with him and was determined to destroy his reputation. The article was vicious, racist, designed to humiliate and shock. Calendar claimed President Jefferson kept a concubine at Monticello, a woman named Sally, as common as the pavement, who had borne him several children. He wrote one boy, named Tom, was said to be the image of the president himself. The article caused a sensation. Jefferson's enemies seized on it gleefully. His supporters were horrified, rushing to his defense. Newspapers nationwide picked up the story, some repeating allegations, others denouncing them as lies. And Thomas Jefferson said nothing, not publicly, not ever. He never issued a denial, never sued for libel, never made any public statement whatsoever. His silence was interpreted by supporters as dignified refusal to engage with gutter journalism. But it also meant accusations were never officially denied, legally challenged, definitively refuted. In private letters to close friends, Jefferson obliquely denied allegations, but so vaguely historians have debated what he was denying. He never mentioned Sally Hemings by name, never specifically addressed whether he fathered her children. His denials were carefully worded, ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation. Why no clear, unequivocal denial if allegations were false? Why not defend his honor more vigorously? The most likely answer, he couldn't. A clear denial would have been a lie, and Jefferson, for all his moral failings, seems to have been reluctant to lie outright. An ambiguous non-denial allowed him to maintain dignity without committing to a falsehood that could be proven wrong. Within Monticello, an elaborate system of discretion was maintained. Sally Hemings occupied a strange position. She was never listed in farm books as working fields. She had no recorded assigned duties. She simply existed, present but invisible, her role undefined, unacknowledged. Her children received special privileges setting them apart from other enslaved children. They were taught to read and write despite Virginia laws forbidding educating enslaved people. They were trained in valuable trades. Sally's daughter Harriet learned to spin and weave, sons Beverly and Madison trained as carpenters, youngest son Eston learned violin, just as his father had. These children were never sold, never sent to fields, never subjected to harsh discipline others endured. They were, in effect, treated as Jefferson's children, though he never acknowledged them as such. And when they came of age, they were allowed to leave. Beverly and Harriet simply walked away from Monticello in their early 20s, disappearing into white society, passing as white, building new lives. There were no formal manumission papers, no legal records of their freedom. They just left, and Jefferson let them go. This was extraordinary. Enslaved people who ran away were hunted, captured, punished severely, advertisements offering rewards for return. But when Beverly and Harriet Hemings left, there were no advertisements, no pursuit, no punishment. They vanished into freedom with Jefferson's tacit permission. Jefferson's white family knew. They had to know. His daughter Patsy, now Martha Jefferson Randolph, lived at Monticello much of her adult life with husband and children. She managed the household, supervised enslaved people, saw Sally Hemings every day, saw children who looked like her father, her dead mother, herself. What did she think? Feel? How reconcile the father she loved, so devoted to her mother, with reality under her roof? We have clues. In letters, Martha Jefferson Randolph made oblique references to painful situation at Monticello, things she wished different but couldn't change. She never mentioned Sally Hemings by name, never explicitly acknowledged the relationship, but pain and discomfort are evident between lines. The family developed a code of silence lasting generations. They didn't talk about Sally Hemings, acknowledge her children, maintained fiction nothing unusual was happening even as evidence walked around Monticello before them. One grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, later provided an explanation the family clung to for nearly 200 years. He admitted, general impression among family that Sally Hemings's children were related to Jefferson's, but claimed it was actually Jefferson's nephew, Peter Carr, or possibly brother Samuel Carr. The story was vague, convenient, plausible enough to create doubt. This explanation had advantages. It acknowledged obvious physical resemblance, too striking to deny, but deflected responsibility from Thomas Jefferson to a younger, less famous relative, less threat to Jefferson's legacy. But there were problems, more apparent as historians examined evidence. Peter and Samuel Carr were often away from Monticello during periods Sally Hemings conceived. Thomas Jefferson was always there. His meticulous records in memorandum books show he was at Monticello 9 months before each of Sally Hemings's children's births. Timing was too perfect, consistent, damning. Moreover, Peter Carr himself, late in life, privately denied fathering Sally Hemings's children. According to family accounts, he was angry the story protected his uncle's reputation at his expense. But the Carr explanation served its purpose, created just enough doubt, plausible deniability for Jefferson's defenders to maintain allegations were unproven, no definitive evidence, all speculation and rumor. As years passed, Monticello's situation grew increasingly surreal. Thomas Jefferson, Declaration author, champion of liberty and natural rights, man who wrote, "All men are created equal," lived with his enslaved mistress and their children while publicly maintaining fiction they didn't exist. He wrote eloquently on slavery's evils, calling it moral depravity, hideous blot on America. In his Notes on the State of Virginia, 1785, he wrote, "Indeed I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever." He worried publicly about God's judgment on a slaveholding nation, proposed gradual emancipation plans. And yet, he owned over 600 people across his lifetime, bought and sold human beings, separated families when financially necessary, had people whipped for disobedience or escape attempts. He freed only a handful in his will, all Hemings family members, likely his own children or his children's siblings. The contradiction wasn't lost on contemporaries. Even admirers were troubled. One visitor noted painful contrast between Jefferson's words and actions, ideals he espoused and reality he lived. But Jefferson seemed unable or unwilling to resolve this. He convinced himself slavery was wrong in principle but necessary in practice, would end eventually but not in his lifetime, that he was trapped by circumstances beyond control. He blamed British for introducing slavery, blamed plantation economics, Southern society, blamed everyone and everything except himself. And all the while, Sally Hemings lived in her room in the South Dependency, bearing his children, raising them in the great house's shadow, knowing they would never be acknowledged, never free until adulthood, never have rights and privileges their white half-siblings took for granted. Thomas Jefferson died July 4, 1826, exactly 50 years after Declaration adoption. A coincidence so perfect, symbolically powerful, it seemed almost providential. John Adams, Jefferson's old friend and rival, other great surviving founder, died same day. Adams's last words, "Thomas Jefferson survives," not knowing Jefferson died hours earlier. Jefferson died at Monticello in his bed, surrounded by white family, legitimate descendants. He was 83, in declining health for years, suffering various ailments, struggling with massive debts plaguing his entire adult life. His will, read shortly after death, freed 5 enslaved people. All were Hemings family members. 2, Madison and Eston, were Sally Hemings's sons, Jefferson's sons. The other 3 were Sally's nephews, sons of her brother John Hemings. But Jefferson did not free Sally herself. Why not? Legal situation was complicated. Virginia law required freed slaves leave state within a year unless receiving special legislative permission to remain. To get permission, Jefferson would have had to petition legislature publicly, explaining why this particular enslaved woman deserved to stay. He would have had to acknowledge her, explain their relationship, make public what he kept private nearly 40 years. He couldn't or wouldn't. Even in death, even freeing some enslaved people, he could not publicly acknowledge Sally Hemings. But he seems to have arranged with daughter Martha. 2 years after Jefferson's death, Sally Hemings quietly given freedom. No formal manumission document, no legal record. Martha simply stopped claiming her as property. Sally allowed to live as free woman in Charlottesville, near sons Madison and Eston, freed by Jefferson's will. She lived last 9 years in freedom, such as it was. In her 50s, no longer young, having spent nearly entire life enslaved. She lived in small Charlottesville house, supported by sons, skilled craftsmen. She never spoke publicly about relationship with Thomas Jefferson, no memoir, interview, never told her side to newspaper or historian. Her silence absolute. By choice. Because she promised Jefferson never to speak. Because she knew no one would believe her, would dismiss her as liar trying to profit from association with great men. Because memories too painful, private, complicated. We will never know. Sally Hemings died 1835, 9 years after Jefferson, buried in unmarked grave in Charlottesville. For over a century and a half, her story remained in shadows, whispered about, never confirmed, acknowledged by some, vehemently denied by others. But her children remembered. They knew who their father was. They knew truth. Some, particularly Madison Hemings, felt compelled to tell that truth, even knowing it would be controversial. Many would refuse to believe. In 1873, 47 years after Jefferson's death, Madison Hemings gave interview to Ohio newspaper the Pike County Republican. He was 68, living in Ohio after gaining freedom. He stated clearly, unequivocally, Thomas Jefferson was his father. He told story of mother's time in Paris, how she was free under French law but agreed to return to Virginia with Jefferson. He said Jefferson promised his mother all their children freed at 21, and Jefferson kept promise. He described childhood at Monticello, special treatment, education, trades taught. Described older siblings Beverly and Harriet allowed to leave, pass into white society. Described his own freedom by Jefferson's will, life since. Interview detailed, specific, consistent with known facts about Monticello. Had ring of truth. But largely ignored, dismissed by historians and public. Madison Hemings was, after all, former slave, black man making extraordinary claims about one of America's most revered figures. Who believe him over Jefferson's white descendants, who continued denying relationship. Hemings' family oral history passed down generations. Sally's descendants told children, grandchildren they descended from Thomas Jefferson. Kept story alive even when rest of America refused to believe, historians dismissed as myth or slander. For over a century and a half, story remained in strange historical limbo. Widely known but officially denied. Discussed in whispers, dismissed in textbooks. Historians debated endlessly, passionate advocates both sides. Some insisted true, pointing to overwhelming circumstantial evidence, timing of Sally's pregnancies, children's resemblance to Jefferson, special treatment, fact Jefferson freed them, Madison Hemings's testimony, Hemings' family oral history. Argued evidence too strong to ignore, denials based more on protecting Jefferson's reputation than analysis of facts. Others insisted false, vicious slander against great men. Pointed to lack of definitive proof, fact Jefferson never acknowledged relationship, Carr family explanation. Argued impossible to prove, evidence circumstantial, should give Jefferson benefit of doubt. Some suggested whole story invented by Jefferson's political enemies to destroy his reputation. Jefferson's white descendants maintained family line for generations, it never happened, resemblance coincidental, timing misleading, accusations politically motivated lies, Peter or Samuel Carr father, not Thomas Jefferson. Family closed ranks, protecting Jefferson's legacy, refusing to acknowledge what many must have known or suspected true. But Sally Hemings's descendants knew truth. They always knew. Passed story down generations, maintaining they descended from Thomas Jefferson, even when rest of America refused to believe, even when mocked, dismissed, accused of lying. Debate might have continued indefinitely, both sides entrenched, if not for science. In 1990s, DNA testing became sophisticated enough to trace paternal lineages through Y chromosome, passed father to son virtually unchanged through generations. In 1998, retired pathologist Eugene Foster organized DNA study. Contacted descendants of Thomas Jefferson's uncle, Field Jefferson, who would have same Y chromosome as Thomas, shared paternal grandfather. Also contacted descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally's youngest son, born 1808 when Jefferson 65. Results published in Journal Nature November 1998, nearly 200 years after Sally Hemings returned from Paris pregnant. Y chromosome DNA of Jefferson male line and Hemings male line matched. Same genetic markers. Probability of coincidence vanishingly small. Combined with historical evidence, timing of conceptions, Hemings family treatment, resemblance noted by contemporaries, Madison Hemings testimony, Hemings family oral history, DNA evidence overwhelming. The Thomas Jefferson Foundation, operating Monticello, commissioned own study by Research Committee of Historians. In 2000, they issued report, Weight of evidence indicated Thomas Jefferson father of all 6 Sally Hemings's children. Impossible secret true. After nearly 200 years denial, debate, controversy, truth finally acknowledged. Thomas Jefferson, Declaration author, 3rd President, founding father of American democracy, indeed fathered children with enslaved woman, his wife's half-sister, woman with no legal power to refuse him. Revelation sent shockwaves through American society. For some, confirmation of long belief. For others, devastating blow to image of Jefferson, founding fathers. For Hemings descendants, vindication after generations dismissed, disbelieved. But here's what makes story deeply disturbing, difficult to process even now, impossible to reduce to simple narrative of villain or victimhood. We will never know what Sally Hemings truly felt. Never know if she loved him, hated him, felt trapped, found some measure of happiness or acceptance. Never know because she was enslaved, and enslaved people's feelings didn't matter in law's eyes. She couldn't refuse him, couldn't leave him, had no power, no choice, no voice recorded or preserved. Modern discussions often use word rape because of fundamental power imbalance. How can there be consent when one person owns the other? How real relationship when one has all power, other none? Even if Sally Hemings had feelings for Jefferson, even if found some happiness, relationship fundamentally coercive because she was enslaved. But we also must be careful not to reduce Sally Hemings to mere victim with no agency. She made choices within extremely limited options. Chose to return from Paris, perhaps believing Jefferson's promises, perhaps no real alternative. Negotiated what she could for children. Survived. Endured. Raised 6 children in impossible circumstances, lived to see some gain freedom. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal, endowed by Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, pursuit of happiness." Words changed world, inspired revolutions, shaped American democracy, articulated ideals America still struggles to live up to over 200 years later. But Jefferson denied those rights to Sally Hemings. Denied them to own children with her. Built nation on principles he couldn't or wouldn't apply to people he claimed to own. Lived life of profound moral contradiction, unable to reconcile ideals with actions, words with deeds. This contradiction not unique to Jefferson. Woven into America's fabric from beginning. Same men who wrote of liberty, equality owned slaves. Same document proclaiming all men created equal written in nation where 1/5 population enslaved. Same revolution fought for freedom left slavery intact, even strengthened it. Understanding Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings forces confrontation with these contradictions, grappling with complexity, moral failures of founding generation. Acknowledging men who created America deeply flawed human beings who did great things and terrible things, often simultaneously. Monticello still stands today. UNESCO World Heritage Site, visited by hundreds of thousands yearly. For most history as museum, Sally Hemings barely mentioned. Tours focused on Jefferson's genius, inventions, architecture, books, wine. Enslaved people who made lifestyle possible largely invisible. But that changed. Recent years, Monticello made concerted effort to tell full story, including Sally Hemings' family. In 2018, exhibition, The Life of Sally Hemings, opened at Monticello, first ever dedicated to her life. Her room in South Dependency restored, now part of tour. Her children acknowledged. Hemings' family finally written back into Monticello's history, Thomas Jefferson's history, America's history. Descendants of Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson held reunions at Monticello, black and white descendants meeting, acknowledging shared ancestry, trying build connections across racial divide separating them 200 years. Powerful symbol of reconciliation, facing difficult truths, trying heal old wounds. But questions remain. How reconcile men who wrote most beautiful words on freedom in English with men who kept own children enslaved? How honor ideals he articulated while acknowledging profound moral failures of personal life? How tell story of America's founding without flinching from contradictions, hypocrisies, deep terrible wrongs woven into nation's fabric from beginning? These not easy questions. No simple answers. Different people answer differently based on values, understanding of history, sense how judge people in different times with different moral frameworks. But questions we must ask, continue asking if understand not just Thomas Jefferson but nation he helped create. We must hold two truths simultaneously, Jefferson brilliant thinker who articulated ideals changing world, and deeply flawed men who failed live up to those ideals. Declaration one of most important documents in human history, and written by men who owned slaves. America founded on liberty, equality principles, and those principles denied millions from beginning. Story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings not just their story. America's story. Story about power and powerlessness, freedom and slavery, ideals proclaimed and realities lived, contradictions carried, truths hidden. Story took 200 years fully acknowledge. And we still grappling with implications today. This mystery shows most disturbing secrets often hide in plain sight. Ones everyone knows but no one wants acknowledge. Ones challenging most cherished beliefs about ourselves, our history. What think of this story? Believe everything revealed. How remember Thomas Jefferson now knowing? Can separate ideas from actions, or inextricably linked? Leave comment below. If enjoyed tale, want more stories on hidden darkness in American history, uncomfortable truths shaping nation, subscribe, hit notification bell, share with someone who loves mysteries, unafraid face difficult truths. See you next.